Hey everyone, welcome. We are in live with Cami with Dr. Deanna Westedt today. If you're watching on Facebook, in our Facebook group, or in our YouTube channel, and we are also, if you're watching this on a podcast, we are also doing Homeschool Success with Cami Wana's podcast. So, welcome everyone. I'm so excited because today we are talking about teaching students with special needs, and it's really such a really big issue today because we have a lot of special needs that are being identified and a lot of kids with special needs, but also we are doing more homeschooling than ever before, which is really great typically for homeschooled kids. So, and a lot of things I've noticed too is students who are, and Deanna and I both have backgrounds in the public education school and the system and everything, and we understand on both ends how it can help and not serve special needs children. So it's really important that we address all aspects. And we're going to talk about, not only are we going to talk about just special needs in general and the whole, like, if you think you might have a child with special needs, but we're also going to talk about, like, okay, now we know, or we already knew, and how do I deal with that mentally as a parent? I think Deanna is amazing at that because she really has gotten through that in her own experience. She has researched about it and she has studied, and has dealt with it with her parents as well that she's taught with in school. And so it's it's such a great treat for us today to have Deanna with us. And then we will also talk hopefully about some strategies and practical and how do we make this actually work and get into your group, because that's really the crux of everything. Like, okay, now we have something, what do we do now, sort of thing. So, and it's going to differ for everybody, but there are some general tips that Deanna is amazing at. So, Dr. Deanna is super awesome. I'm so excited to have you with us today. Thank you so much. I am so excited. So, what can you just share with us a little bit about your background? I know you've been with us before talking about reading and learning to read for littles. And if you haven't checked out her YouTube video, make sure you do because she has awesome, sweet little videos for little ones. And but you have this background in teaching reading, but you also have another background in special education. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So, I was in the classroom for a little over 20 years. During that time, I did a combination. I job shared, but I always kept my foot in the door. At one point, I only worked one day a week. I was really focused on the education of my boys at that time. So, in any case, uh, you know, my experience really led me to have a heart for families that were trying to figure things out with their children. And that grew as I was raising my own two boys and through our journey of figuring out what worked for them and entering into this understanding of twice exceptional, which is really a child that has learning challenges and also overlaps with giftedness. So that became actually my passion in my research, my dissertation study. And I focused on how to differentiate, which means uh, making sure that instruction is meeting children where they're coming at. So that's my passion. My passion is to really share with families these strategies, this hope, and this message, and to bring encouragement to families as well.
Yeah, and that's something that is a buzzword in education, is differentiation, right? It's something that
It is.
everybody just, it's always like, okay, we're going to differentiate and teach teachers how to differentiate. And I've been through those trainings lots of times. And it's really it's like, yeah, that would be awesome to be able to do. Not super practical in a regular classroom with so many students. You can do it to a certain degree, but it's very limited. And
Correct.
so it's hard to really meet the needs on the high end and the low end when you're constantly trying to you're trying to catch everybody at one time. And so it's really
Correct.
difficult.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it became very apparent through, and I remember, and you know, through the process of learning about my kids and learning about this, digging deeper into the literature about students with these overlaps and these challenges, I started to discover things about myself, and it started to become clear to me why I went for 3 years from second, third, and fourth grade without completing work. And so all of these things started to really, really make sense. But what I discovered, and part of my frustration would be that so much of what was being required by the district was performative, which means that it was checking boxes, but it wasn't actually addressing in a very unique and genuine way. And so I had designed this process that really, really worked, but found that it was very hard to break through some of that wall. This is the systematic wall that's there. So with my own boys, especially my older one, there was a time where I came to understand that even when we had him in a placement that was loving and kind and just really appreciated his strengths, in that setting with that many students, no matter how great the teacher was, he was going to fall through the cracks. That was not the teacher's fault. That was not, anything. It was just really that placement wasn't working for him. And that was difficult for me to accept at some point. Of course, you fast forward a few months into our homeschooling, when we dove back into homeschooling as older students, and, wishing that we had done it sooner, of course. And I share that with parents too, because oftentimes as we're walking a journey with a child that may have developmental delays, or you're starting to notice some uniqueness that you're not sure about, when you get to the answers and you start to find the things that are working, sometimes you encounter regrets, you encounter guilt. All of these feelings are very normal. You grieve over the time that was lost. You grieve over maybe some of the challenges that they struggled through or will struggle through. And all of these feelings are so normal. But I really encourage families, and this is a point that I came to, and I had to walk this pathway as well, of a thought process of, all right, well, that was the process that we had to go through to get to where we are today. And you can only make the best decisions that you can with what you know at the time. So, to really encourage families that wherever they are in their journey, you just keep moving forward. And it's hard not to look back and think, oh, I wish I would have done this if I had known that, if only, is a lot of the narrative that plays in our heads sometimes as we navigate this. But really, to have compassion with yourself as well, because one thing I have genuinely learned about parents, the more that I work with families in the homeschool community, the more, even throughout my classroom time, really, parents do want the best for their kids,
Of course. Yeah.
and in a healthy structure, they do, and we do the best that we can for our kids. So I just want to encourage families out there, if you're at a place where you're encountering this, you're unsure, or you're just finding things out for the first time, do focus on moving forward and not being hard on yourself.
I love that. And that's one of the things I love the most about your message, is just the message of like, hey, let's keep trucking. Let's keep moving. Let's like pull the keep the train going. And I love that, because that guilt, that pressure that you have on yourself, it definitely weighs on your kids. It definitely, they feel that as well. They feel everything that you do, and they know that it's there. And
Absolutely.
that will, I don't know about you, but it also, your experience, but it also helps them not feel guilty, right?
Hmm.
I mean, they probably are like, man, I wish sorry, I'm not a superstar. you know,
Yeah, when really there are,
they are.
there's so much, and honestly, that's a very interesting thing, because there are dynamics that I call it the unspoken dialogue. And there's things that they pick up, just within different circumstances, whether it be in play groups or if they're coming from a school setting. And again, there are a lot of very genuine people, and we know personally, that are in the school system that love children and are there for the best of children. But unfortunately, some of I call it the classroom box. We have a lot of children that don't fit within that classroom box, and they never were intended to fit inside that classroom box. And instead of recognizing what they bring to the table, we often find that those children are marginalized in a classroom setting, unfortunately. And that's not the intention of so many great people that are in this setting. It's just the way that it's structured.
Right.
So with that, I know that some people, sometimes we just have to feel our feelings. It's great to say, hey, this challenge comes with these benefits. The way my brain is wired, I can share. There's things that are harder for me. It can be very hard for me to focus. I was 10 years old using Post-it notes to remember my thoughts at bedtime because I would get this great idea. And I mean, this was like on the nightly. Okay. And I would write down my little thought, and I came up with that strategy. I was coping. I was finding what strategies, even at that age, to help. And I still love Post-it notes. I mean, I have them right here. I love Post-it notes. But, the thing is that there are challenges, and sometimes it's okay to sit in that and say, man, this stinks. This is hard. And it's okay to feel that. But we don't want to miss the fact that the way that children's brains are wired, just because they're wired differently doesn't mean that they don't bring something to the table. And
Absolutely.
oftentimes those are the brains that they're thinking outside the box, and they are going to be the creators, the inventors. I see that with my son. One of the best things we did was we took him out of that setting, and we were very mindful to make sure, okay, what are his goals? What does he need to achieve those goals? So that's something to consider. If you're in the state of California, which we both are, it's if a college, certain colleges need certain types of classes. So you want to make sure that the classes that you're using meet those guidelines. So there's different things to consider, and those are all great points. But at the same time, when we brought him out of that setting, we, for the first time, saw him engage in discovering his strengths for himself. So I call us eclectic homeschoolers. We have today, for instance, is Thursday. It's an unschooling day for us. And that means that he does his he goes and volunteers, he does his projects, but we also are making sure for his purposes, and this is a case by case basis, but he does have his what we call school at home classes. We do some classical dynamics as well. We've brought in over the years. So that's just to give parents encouragement as well, that homeschooling doesn't have to look like one thing for your child. That is when we think about how to approach it, you look at what your child's strengths are, what are their needs, and you can address both of those things in parallel at the same time.
Absolutely. That's so important. And you guys, I hope you're taking notes on this and definitely watch the replay because it's something that's really important to understand. Big picture thinking is that all kids are geniuses in their own way. And it's so true if you look back in history that all the great thinkers of the world, well, I'm not going to say all of them, not going to generalize, but most of them, if you look back, were rascally kind of like out of the box thinkers. They weren't super A students. They weren't, in that traditional mentality. And so when you're thinking about your kids and thinking about like, oh, they're not fitting into this box, the box is manufactured, okay, by somebody. So it doesn't they're not everybody's going to fit in that box, and that's totally fine. And that's the beauty of homeschooling, and that's the beauty of where you as a parent can be their advocate. And I love that hope and inspiration that your kids are absolute geniuses and focus on their strengths. And that's what we teach in the Homeschool Success Club and the Homeschool Success Mastery, which, by the way, you guys, Dr. Deanna is actually one of our guest presenters in the Homeschool Success Mastery course. You're getting like a sneak peek of her huge workshop that she did in the Homeschool Success Mastery course. So you guys, the foundation of this lies in the Homeschool Success Club and in the thinking of that, changing your thinking. And that's what we're really talking about as parents, is opening up and thinking like, okay, I have the best intentions. I want to help my child for sure. And they have genius. So how am I going to best do that? And it could be very overwhelming because it's not like, oh, somebody writes a book on it and they say, okay, here's your manual. That's how it goes. So in talking about that, if we suspect our kids might have some sort of special needs, let's talk about the diagnoses for a second, because I know this is something we talked about in the Homeschool Success Mastery program in your workshop. We had a huge conversation about diagnosing or not to diagnose, the pros and cons, because there are both. And so what do you think are some of the pros and the cons of diagnosing?
So when we look at the pros of that, and this is absolutely a case by case basis, when we have a child that we feel would benefit from services or some sort of accommodations, sometimes getting that question answered will help direct the way that we address it. But the flip side of that is, and this goes into just the broad range that we have and the overlaps. I share about this a little bit too, that like ASD overlaps, the characteristics can overlap with ADHD, and they can also be present, an overlap in one child. We can have a child with both diagnoses. However, a lot of families find it very, very difficult to get the spectrum diagnosis. That can be very elusive
and expensive, right? I mean,
and expensive. And our metrics they have their limitations, and so, one thing personally that we've come up against is our son is extremely social. And that for current, it is starting to change, but at the root of it though, we came to understand that the label in this case was less important than the way that we address it, because it doesn't matter. Now, I want to put that with a grain of salt, because sometimes when it comes to getting certain accommodations, if you want to get into Americans with Disabilities Act and they're going to go into a college setting or a work environment where they might need accommodations for dysgraphia, for instance, if they need to be able to scribe or to tape record, that might be a reason to get a diagnosis. And typically that's going to be, I won't say an easy diagnosis, but that's going to be a more standardized. Our experience with that diagnosis is it's much more, it's not subjective. There's more objective criteria that we have. So with that in mind, there are absolutely times where a diagnosis, and young, although carefully considering that just because your child's not reading, I talk about this a lot, but just because your child's not reading at 5 doesn't mean they have a learning disability. We want them reading by 9, typically, developmentally speaking, but there could be still a range. So with that being said, if you do suspect something, there's no, I don't want to say no harm, but a case by case basis, sometimes to get that professional opinion, if you do your homework and find out who's you can trust to give that recommendation, that professional eye on it, that can be a good thing, because there's a lot of developmental things that if they're not addressed early, it can be harder later on. And just to share from our personal perspective, experience, there are residual things. For example, there were some things that we didn't get addressed. Actually, we got them addressed earlier than some, but still there had been a couple of years that went by. We were in the school system at the time, and unfortunately, there were some executive functioning, like organization skills, developmental skills that he was delayed in. And some of that had to do with he missed that because other things were so hard for him at the time. And that's okay. I mean, with dysgraphia, for instance, there were some delays in things like grammar and spelling that were residual even when we started addressing the dysgraphia. And that's just kind of what it is when I talk about moving forward and saying, oh, I wish, well, sometimes you just can't know earlier. We don't have that manual. We are doing the absolute best. But if you suspect it, find, ask around, do your homework, find a professional that comes recommended, that it would be an educational psychologist can do a diagnosis. If you're talking about ADHD and things like that, it would be, one option is a psychiatrist that does that. And I know that can feel a little bit weird, but it's not. It's really the functioning of the brain, and talking about actually the functioning of a brain in an ADHD person. I got a little on a tangent, but I'm very passionate about this, is that in our society, sometimes we hear the message, oh, that's just an excuse to not parent, or that's just an excuse. There are different brain functions in the ADHD brain that we are now finding through science, and it's actually to do with the dopamine in the brain. So, this isn't a debate about how you address it, but even getting into, the medicine that is used to treat that, if you go that route, which there's many different ways to address it, but that's not a sedative. It's actually a stimulant that acts different on the ADHD brain, because clinically the ADHD brain is wired differently. And that's okay, because there's a lot of ways they think differently in a great way because of that wiring. It's just that it makes other things a little harder. But sometimes some of the things that are harder for them are part of that classroom box that maybe they weren't intended to be in the first place. So, but anyway, so that might be
Yes.
a reason to diagnose, is if you feel that the accommodations will be significant, if there's a treatment that you need, and to get a diagnosis in order to have health insurance. Those are reasons to get a diagnosis. If you want to talk about, do you want me to go into the cons?
Yeah. And well, before you do that, I definitely wanted to mention that there are a lot of reasons too, but I also know that there are times when you don't need to stress out so much about it. And
Yes.
it depends on the case, of course, but
Yes.
that I think looking back now, knowing more about what I do about dysgraphia and dyslexia, is that it's very, very common, like very, very crazy common. And that I actually think that probably my husband and my son both have it. But we never got a diagnosis. I never felt we needed to.
Mhm.
I felt we dealt with it in a way that it just was, well, if it is, I mean, we're doing okay. And it
Mhm.
came in its own
Absolutely.
time, and he's doing amazing and it totally like flourishing. And it just was something that he adapted and was able to overcome by himself, and like with our help, and not pushing him and things like that. And so it's really interesting, I feel like, and in his case, I'm glad we didn't, because he's very, very hard on himself, and he's very
Mm, that's
um
so true. Yeah,
and so I
I
feel
understand.
like if that would have been known, it would have been kind of detrimental to him in particular. Not every kid's like that, but he's like, I mean, very self-reflective, and so that would have been something that we
Yes.
would have had. But saying that, the addressing of it as a parent, whether you even need to tell them about it at all, or right now, maybe later, who knows, that's up to you. But But that may be something, and how you personally address it as a parent
Mhm.
is super important, and I know you talked about that in the workshop.
Yeah, it is important. And there's, talking about it, absolutely, like children, we know our children. And if we know that this is going to be something that holds them back, that can be, and there's still ways to address it,
Yes.
and I think that you have to look at the spectrum. One of the things, and I think we've lost this in the system a bit, but one of the things that I know is we look at how is it affecting their ability to access the curriculum or access the learning. And there's ways to address it. For example, with our son, I mean, honestly, I wasn't even there knowing that this was an issue. And with that, but what things that we did to address it were things that you can do without a diagnosis too. So keeping in mind that there is a spectrum of, dysgraphia, there is a spectrum of
Absolutely.
dyslexia. And so I think that you also, like you said, that the ways that you were able to address it work just fine. And he's come to a point where he is flourishing and successful, and that's not holding him back. And then as parents, I think we also need to know it's okay to reflect and decide, hey, you know what? I made that decision based on this, but I think we need to go a little different route.
Yes.
So, that's okay too. For us, we did a lot of dictation, we did a lot of modeling before he was really able to fully write, his own. Uh, as far as letter formation was just, I mean, he could, but it was a very weighty task for him. So what we did is we still modeled for him the thinking of how are we building a paragraph? These are our transition phrases. We did all of those, word choice and shades of meaning. All of these things we still did. We didn't wait till he was able to be independent in his writing. And that's
Right.
another thing I want to encourage parents is that, because some of that will follow developmentally, the ability can follow developmentally, but the know-how of all of those higher level thinking, we can still be modeling for our children.
Absolutely.
And when that catches up, they'll be ready. And so that's one of the pieces that I think is missed often, because we get so engaged, and this happens in the classroom too. This was one of my big things in my research, was we focus so much on the challenges that we miss the strengths, and we miss those opportunities to grow their oral language. We miss the opportunities to grow their engagement with text, because we're so focused on, oh my gosh, they're not blending, which, trust me, I get it. I've been there with students, because I was receiving that message. And with my own son, he was an early reader, and then when the text got smaller, all of a sudden we found he doesn't want to read anymore when he got to chapter books. And what's going on? Well, it turns out that his eyes weren't tracking, his muscles weren't developed. And so, and that comes to also, get curious with your kids. If you notice they're resistive to something, and how to approach that as a parent, it's frustrating, right? Because especially if you're homeschooling, and I see a lot of people have questions like, my child just doesn't want to do it, and I think they're just, they're just being, they look like they're just being
Stubborn.
difficult.
Right.
Right. And by all means, as parents, we are the authority, we are that foundation for our kids. But don't be afraid at a different moment, not when you're in the midst of the crisis. It's okay to we had a calming corner that was amazing. That did work. Sometimes moms need calming corners too, and that might look like having a coffee and watching a show on TV. I don't know, but whatever the calming corner is for each individual. But at a later time, being able to circle back and say, I noticed that when we do this task, or we go to do this, that it's really hard for you, that you don't want to do it. Can you help me understand? Like, genuine, you're not being sarcastic, like, hey, it's not that hard, what's going on? No, you, what is hard about that? Because even from my personal experience, being that child that didn't finish my work for 3 years and I missed every single recess, but I was reading at a high school level and everyone knew that about me, but I was still being punished for not finishing my work. Um, I wish that somebody had come alongside me at that time and said, "Hey, I've noticed you don't finish your work. What's going on?" And I would have told them, "Hey, I'm taking." Well, I didn't call it a brain break, but I'm making patterns out of numbers and making stories up about pictures. Isn't that what I thought all the other kids were doing that? I needed somebody to come and help me connect those dots
Right.
because that was the only thing I knew as being normal. And another little insight is that things like ADHD can look different in girls than in boys. And it varies, obviously. Not every girl is this, not every boy is, going to follow this exact characteristic. But, it was missed in me because I wasn't hyperactive and I wanted to please. I was very quiet, but yet my brain was still engaging in behaviors to help cope with being overwhelmed by a task. And so that's something also to look at too when we're finding our children are resistive to a task or having trouble completing. Whatever their smallest success point is, build 2 minutes. If they can work 2 minutes on
Oh
their
my gosh.
own,
Yeah.
celebrate it, and next time try for 3. But whatever their success point is, use that as your foundation and a springboard for more success.
I love that. And we talked in the Homeschool Success Mastery program about the difference in the girls and boys a little bit more. And we talked about
Yeah.
how you said it might be a little more difficult to identify in the girls just in general because they kind of mask and
Mm-hmm.
just survive, right?
Correct.
Yeah, I
Correct.
love that, you guys. So thinking about you gave a lot of tips already, practicality speaking. So practically speaking, what else can we think about as far as okay, we're trying to get into a groove now. We're trying to figure out how to schedule and like really make a pattern that works for our kids. And every kid's going to be different, of course, but I know you have some things like with your son about the transitions and things that you did that were really made a difference. So can you share just a couple with us?
Yeah, and that's one of my favorite my favorite stories. Was very pivotal, but yeah, we had a hard time transitioning from Legos, and I was convinced he just doesn't want to stop playing Legos. I mean, right? That's
I
what
mean, who does?
who does, right? And when I got curious about it and asked him in a moment where we weren't in crisis of trying to get to, whatever activity we needed to get into the car to go to, and I asked him, why is that hard? And he thought about it and he said, Mom, I'm afraid I'm not going to know where to start again. I don't, I need to find my stopping point. And, I say this to parents, it's not in a way having the child you're not giving them control. You are giving them a voice. You're teaching them how to communicate and you're teaching them time management, right? So you are still the guide, you're still the mentor, you're still the authority in this, but you're coming alongside your child and you're saying, this is hard for you. Help me understand why. And then let's think together, heads together, to come up with a solution. And this is actually grounded. I want to give, this resource. It's grounded in the work of Dr. Ross Greene. He started out by writing a book for schools, which I wish actually more would implement because we would have a lot less school to prison pipeline and we'd have a lot less suspensions going on. I'm not against consequences, but at the same time, arbitrary is arbitrary, and not getting to the root. He wrote an excellent book, but then he wrote for parents as well. And it's called The Explosive Child, but it also goes for the implosive child, which means that they're internalizing their frustrations. And it's basically unsolved problems. So get curious with your child, ask them, why is this hard for you? Don't expect it to get solved the first time. It's a process, and be patient with yourself and with your child.
Oh my gosh, that's so key, you guys. And that isn't that parenting in a nutshell right there.
The
But
process.
it's a process, it's a journey. And that's homeschooling. And that's I love we go into way more detail and Dr. Deanna talks about it in so much great detail in the Homeschool Success Mastery program. If you're curious about that, definitely reach out to me, and I can drop the link in there in the comments of our Facebook group and YouTube channel. But if you have questions or you have specific concerns, or like, I don't even know how I'm thinking about this, whatever, definitely reach out. I can get you in touch with Dr. Deanna. If you're in our Facebook group, she's in there as well. If you are in her, if you're watching this on YouTube or if you're in our podcast, it's all in the show notes as well. So make sure that you check that out. You can contact her directly. But you guys, this has been so exciting. This is something I feel like I've always wanted to cover and really need, because it's a growing thing, and it's something that I just today have read at least 5 different posts from parents that pulled their kids out of public school because of special needs, not being addressed. And so, you guys, there are resources out there, and it's so important for you to have your thinking straight, but be very hopeful as well. And that's what I love. So thank you, Deanna, for sharing with us
You're
today. I
welcome.
really appreciate it. And you guys, we will talk to you next week with we are back with Brittany Young and talking about entrepreneurship. So I'm very excited. Join us next week. See you then. Bye-bye.
Bye.